That's a good one.
I'm going to have him bring that down a notch or three.
Number 6.
How sweet it is to hold a newborn baby. It's all a
Wonderful day I'll never forget. When I was wandering miles away, Jesus, my Savior, I met. What a tender, compassionate friend, He met the need of my heart. Shadows dispelling with joy, I am telling, He made all the darkness depart. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When at the cross my Savior made me whole, my sins were washed away, and my life was turned to day. Heaven came down and glory filled my soul. When heaven came down and glory filled my soul.
Easier.
Hang on here. Number 27. Towards the back.
One of my favorite ones.
Every night in Jesus, all our sins and grief to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forget. Oh, what needless pain we bear. Oh, because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. And we triumph in temptation, if there's trouble anywhere. We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful, who will all our sorrows share? Jesus knows our every weakness.
Man, that was good.
Can I say something before you go?
No, I'm sorry, you're not allowed.
What?
I just want to say, and I'll be brief, October, I believe, and usually was, Preacher Appreciation Month. Yes, it is. And
Yes.
there's lots of preachers. Good ones are few and far between, but just because someone's a preacher doesn't mean they're a teacher. And I want to change it to Teacher Appreciation Month. I appreciate our teachers. Well, we all do.
Well,
Thank you.
Well, what's the luck with that?
Well, we keep coming back because
Yes.
we do appreciate. I thought it was the food.
No,
No, it's your company. Oh, no, I don't think that's it. But
we figured it this way. If we stay in there long enough, he's going to hit a big one.
You've done that more than once.
All right. Thank you.
Questions?
Ah,
I didn't do so good because I was gone and I did do very good this one. Some of them ones I did. You did better than I did. I know that feeling.
All right. Jordan River. What does the word Jordan mean in Hebrew?
Did you answer that one? You answered that one.
Jordan in Hebrew means
Jordan.
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 That's one translation from Hebrew,
Yes.
and it means
It means the coming down.
coming down.
Yes. Coming way down.
Is that what you?
I have spread judgment.
Spread judgment.
What was it?
Spread judgment.
Spread judgment.
Spread judgment.
Well,
Close.
Suggan's Abridged Dictionary
That's what
says
it says.
it's the coming down.
Yes, because I have, excuse me, I have a translation here as a descender, which is coming down.
Yes, yes.
So do we know why it's called that way?
Yes, because few rivers run upstream.
And it runs from up
Yes.
to down.
And that's the way that's the way grace comes down.
Very good. That's good.
Comes down from on high.
Yes.
As the river starts at Mount Hermon.
Are you answering questions here?
Because
Are you prepared?
I love your subtlety.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a little about geography.
Yes.
Norm, I'm sure you're ready for that one. Do you
They didn't
know?
get the question. They
I
didn't
think
get
it's
the question.
question.
They weren't here last week.
You just like
Give me
to
a
be a
zero.
bad student.
Professor, give me a 0. You flunked that one.
Okay, so what do we know about
You
geography?
can read my cheat sheet.
Well, Mikey, you better help me, brother.
What do we know about the geography of Jordan?
Michael, hush up. She's trying to.
Geography.
Yes.
Where it's located.
Palestine.
So where it starts. Sorry, I forgot. I had the busy week too. It's not an excuse, but I meant to have a map there. But if you look at the map, so it runs almost directly from north to south.
Right.
Okay?
Yes.
And if you look at the map, it starts in the foothills of Mount Hermon.
Yes.
And of course it runs into the Dead Sea.
See.
Okay? So it's called descender because I found this information here. Does anyone else have it?
Yes. It falls, what was it, 700 feet in 20 some miles or something like that?
It rushes down at the rate of 25 feet per mile and descends from about 1,200 feet above sea level to 1,286 feet below sea level. So which is a big gap,
Yes.
right?
It's a big drop in that time, 2,500 feet.
Okay. What events from biblical history involved in Jordan?
interesting note, I found that Elijah, before this period of time, about 1250, somewhere in there, he had, or somebody had, lost an axe in the river. And he was able to find that axe by praying, and the axe, the bronze axe or whatever they had back then, floated to the top of the river, and they were able to retrieve it. I thought that was very interesting.
Did you hear that too, Pam?
I read something about that, but I didn't know when it happened.
Where did you? What's the source?
I ran into it online, but I didn't research it because I was actually in the car on the way here.
You're online and you're on the way here and you're driving?
Of course. No.
Did you say Elijah or Elijah?
What did we learn about wine?
Elijah.
S-H?
Yeah.
Elijah. Okay.
Elijah.
Okay,
But
I didn't. Do you recall this?
But I didn't think it was that. I thought it was something in the New Testament where they made it float or something.
Okay.
It's in Kings someplace.
Uh-huh.
I was surprised on how many miracles had happened around and about the Jordan.
That's right.
From the baptismal point to the parting of the waters and on and on and on.
Let me ask you this: who was the most important and famous person baptized in Jordan River?
Jesus.
Good. Jesus.
Who
Then
said
the
that?
second was my mother. I'm not kidding. She was
Gary and Jane.
Yeah, Gary and Yes.
Jordan.
That was
Yeah, she wanted to be baptized in Jordan
That
River.
would be neat, yeah. A lot of people, when they get there, that's
Right.
one thing they
Right.
want to do. Did Naaman have to dip? Is that where he dipped to? Was it the Jordan River?
The what?
Naaman.
No. To be healed?
Yeah. I don't think it was the Jordan.
So our Lord Jesus Christ was baptized in Jordan River. This is one. Another one we were just talking last couple times. The nation of Israel was crossing the Jordan River, and God performed a miracle by splitting the water. What else about Elijah from Old Testament?
After he was baptized?
I'm sorry?
Go from, I don't know, I might be saying something.
Well, Elijah
Somebody
crossed
went
the
up to
river
the
too.
heavens.
That's right.
On dry
And what
land.
happened?
Pardon?
What happened?
Well, he crossed the river and didn't get wet either.
That's right. Yes. Because it was exactly the same miracle happened.
Well, that's what happened. See, he was crossing the river, lost his axe.
Oh, I know. Okay.
Huh?
Okay.
This is
Okay.
gonna be good.
And Joshua found it, right?
If I
They
don't
thought it
know,
was one of the rocks. They thought it was one of the rocks when they were protecting that victim about having a fit with you.
So Jordan River was
The new history of the Old Testament.
Right.
Boy, Mikey, keep it up.
well, you know what they always say, Thorne? If you
we
can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit.
I understand that, Micah. That's really
so
good.
Jordan River was involved in many very important biblical events, including the ones which are now studying.
Amen. So many, I was really surprised.
Yes, like you said the last time, miracles were happening just one after another and so fast, and it was amazing. So who carried the Ark of the Covenant and why? Ready again?
Let her.
I didn't raise my
Okay,
hand.
let's dance.
No,
You
no.
can?
She doesn't know the answer.
No, of course.
I might. She might. Once the geography one is over, I might know that. I understand.
You want me to help you with that?
No. I'm the priest carried it, and the reason why is because it was holy.
Mm-hmm.
But am I right to say not just priest, but Leviticus priest, because isn't that the tribe of
Levi.
priests?
Mhm.
So they were all Levi.
Levi.
Okay,
Mm-hmm. That's it?
that's all I got.
Okay, I came up with a big study on this one because first of all, I was trying to figure out how many people were carrying the ark. Do we know that?
Yes, 4.
How do we know?
Because
Right.
one on,
I'm sorry.
one on each.
You be quiet. Let her. I don't have to.
Well,
tell.
You always used to fall asleep.
I know.
I couldn't find the place which would say a number 4 in Bible. Okay, so logically it's to think that 4 people would carry it. Okay.
Yes.
But I went back to Numbers and to what you just said, Jan. In Numbers 3, the Lord explains to Moses why the sons of Levi shall be mine. Okay, so it's the story, why Levi, why them. Okay, and he says that I have taken the Levites from among the sons of Israel instead of every firstborn, for all the firstborn are mine. They're mine. So, and then he tells Moses to number them by families, which Moses does, and he comes up with the results, which I'm not going into now, but if you're interested, Gary, you would appreciate this. I made up a chart.
Good for you. Way to go.
Wow.
And it makes it very clear here in this chart who were Levites, their families, their children, and their functions, their responsibilities, their duties, okay, and how they moved in terms of tabernacle.
You want to start your own Ancestry.com?
Now, were they not? They weren't allowed to touch the ark either, were they? I mean,
No.
other than the rods. Is that true?
So in Numbers, we learned that the ark was under responsibility of the sons of Kohath. That's one of those 3 Levites. The duties of the descendants of Kohath concerning the most holy things included when Aaron and his sons had finished covering the holy objects, and then it goes on and on. So they were to carry the ark. That was one of their duties. So we know exactly who they were, but we cannot be certain for 100%. I think that there are 4 of them, although logically, kind of.
Except that was made out of wood, was covered in gold, had a lot of statue, the angels on top. So it would have been kind of heavy. I would have
Presumably
thought.
very heavy.
So 4 people or 4 men, a little iffy on that.
That's exactly what I
Well,
thought.
they traded off.
But anyhow, Janet was right, and they were not supposed to, other people were not supposed to touch it.
Another interesting thing that I got from Al Wynn's dictionary of trivia, that they were, the priests were the only ones that were consecrated to carry the ark.
I don't know. Do you know? Is that correct? Okay. Correct.
I have a question about.
Janet, remember questions? Go there.
No, there are questions about what you said. Now I forget what the question was, but not because of you. When I asked it, okay. When I asked it, they weren't allowed to touch it, right? I meant, because I knew the people weren't allowed to touch the ark, and that's why they stayed back and everything. But the Levite priests that were carrying it, of course, they had to touch the rods. But were they not allowed to touch anything else but the rods?
Correct.
Right. Okay, so, and I don't remember what
I think so. I'm still not very good in
I was
starting learning it, but
I was just wondering, I know it said the length and all that and stuff, but I was just wondering, once the rods, the part that was sticking out, and if the priests weren't allowed to touch anything but the rods, maybe we could figure out, I guess if a person wanted to, they could maybe figure out if there would have even been room to buddy up on one end of one rod.
Well, it tells how long those rods
Well, that's what I'm saying. If I don't remember what it is and all
I
that,
don't know.
and then you have to allow for the space, that. I'm just saying. I wonder, if there was 8 inches sticking out or 4 feet or what. So that might help.
So
logically.
the ark and tabernacles are like a big study.
Right, yeah, well, that's what I'm
It's
saying,
very,
yeah.
very complicating to me. Okay, nations finishes crossing the Jordan River. Israel. The priests keep holding the ark and remain standing in the middle of the river, dry river, and 12 men, one from each tribe, each pick up one stone from the middle of the river, carry them to the west bank, and make a pile. And what was the meaning of this pile? That's an easy question.
To show the people that come after them, their children and their children's children. It was just a memorial to remind them of actually what had happened there.
About the miracle God did there for people in Israel. Yes. Okay, give examples when God did his judgment through flooding waters. Just example. When he would do his judgment using water or flooding water.
No, it's our,
No, right. That's the flooding. Yes.
The Red Sea, Jonah, Pharaoh in Egypt.
Right. He destroyed all the chariots and everyone who were chasing the Israelites. Okay, they were dead. Okay, I thought, God uses waters to do judgment. But Satan sometimes also uses it as always making a bad copy of what God does. So God does his judgment using waters to, for people's good, in other words, to teach them a lesson, Satan also, I don't know if you would agree with me, Satan also uses water sometimes to destroy people's lives, to, do everything. But that's just because of evil. So I'm talking about difference between two usages of water in this term. Okay. Joshua sets up another 12 stones in the middle of Jordan, and the place where the feet of the priests were standing. So what was the purpose of that pile, and what was the difference between two piles? So we have one pile on the west bank from 12 tribes representatives made a pile, and another one Joshua made in the middle of the river. So what was?
I didn't understand that.
You didn't understand that? Okay.
I have something if nobody else does.
Jen, do you have an answer?
Because I don't want to be like Mike. I have. The purpose of it was to show, it was evidence of the truth of God's miracle, and people would usually only see it when the waters were low, like a drought, and a drought usually, was never good. And so if they would, for example, if they would see it during a drought, it would remind them that God would protect and take care of them and provide for them. Am I supposed to do the other question, too?
Very good.
Do you want me to do the other question?
Mike, the pile which was, as far as I understood, the pile which was made on the west side. So 12 stones were brought to the west side, and there was set a pile. It was evident at any time to anybody.
correct.
Okay. Then the second pile, which was made by Joshua himself, it was in the middle of the river. So when the water is high, you cannot see it. When water goes down, it, they raise up and from the water and you could see it. In other words, it was, how you said it, honey, last time, grace versus judgment. In other words, you could see it only in times of
Difficulties.
difficulties.
Right.
Yes. That was the difference. far as did I get this right? He doesn't listen to me. Okay.
Are you done with that one?
He cannot wait when I finish.
No, I'm just saying.
One more.
One more. Well,
And that's it.
but there's.
Oh, you're talking about
He wants to make a
Do I get a
comment.
cake?
He wants to-
No, I don't.
Afterwards.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay,
You got
okay.
it.
Honey, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you want. Okay.
Well, it's Mark 3. I tried to bring this back to Mark 3.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Matthew 3, where the Pharisees are coming. John the Baptist is baptizing. The Pharisees are coming. John realizes they're not there for the purpose of real repentance. They're there for a show. And he says to them, verse 7, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, he said to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come. Therefore, bring forth repentance and bring forth fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not suppose that you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I say to you that God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. He's baptizing in the middle of the Jordan River. Where? Where's the place? Called Bethbara. Called Bethbara, which is exactly the place that the water split and the people came across the Jordan River. Exact same place.
Wow.
So he says,
And the priest stood right there in the middle.
this priest in the middle. That's where Joshua piled up the stones where the priest's feet were standing. So that's why I think the Jordan also means a descending judgment, because he's talking about a judgment that also could come for those that do not understand what Yahshua is doing.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, it was a little difficult. Okay, the last one. Finally, all the nation is safe on the west bank of Jordan. The priests with the ark come up from the middle of Jordan. Their feet step on the dry ground of the bank, and the waters of Jordan immediately roar back to their place and go over all its banks. What is the deeper meaning of this image? We can imagine the picture, the last foot stepped on the bank and boom, it all came back.
I got grace versus judgment on that one.
Okay, Robin.
I'm not elaborating, I just got...
Go for it,
I
Helen.
have something. Mike, elaborate on that.
He doesn't have that.
You want me more dazzled?
No.
I couldn't think of anything, and I couldn't find anything in Scripture that really specifically dealt with that, other than the fact that maybe it was some kind of a judgment on the people who didn't believe.
I think it's not really. I don't think it's really difficult here, because feet are in the water, presence of God is there, everything is great. Priests came out of the water, presence of God leaves that place, and judgment came back again. In other words, grace versus judgment.
I guess what I was trying to read into that was something like Noah and the ark, and what happened when they all got in the boat. Everybody else was lost in the water, and I was thinking along the same lines for those that don't follow God.
Mm-hmm.
It was not that the water at that time, if you could follow this, it wasn't the fact that the water came back and flooded the whole area and killed people, because it didn't do that, or the script doesn't say that it did that. But in theory, then those that walked across the river on dry ground were following God. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So they were transported on, and the rest that don't follow God, then they're forever lost.
Like the same with Noah's
Right.
Ark.
So it was
Mhm,
kind of
mhm.
a clearinghouse, so to speak, the ones that do believe in God and the ones that
Yeah,
don't.
that's
And
a good one.
What
do you think,
That's a
Jan?
good one.
Well, that's pretty much that. I mean, not that deep, but then we, and thing that I sort of have extra. Well, what I wrote was God's judgment comes over the people, but His mercy and grace protects them from destruction. Not just, well, to me, and maybe I'm thinking mercy and grace wrong, but His grace opened the river for Him and everything, but also mercy, because even His people had been bad at times. So He did this for them, even though they had been bad, because, well, if I keep, if you're
Same
saved,
with
you're
us.
saved.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same with us.
yeah.
Okay, everybody, great. Not everybody.
there was only one
But
other
great.
thought that came to my mind along with that,
Yeah.
was the fact that, like Jonah,
Mm-hmm.
if he hadn't submitted them to God, he would have been lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Well, yeah.
So,
Now you can go on and on and on.
Oh, I think too that the way it describes it says it roared back. I can't say R, so Troy or Troy, but anyway, it roared back, to the place where, it's like it didn't just like do, like.
Right.
And I think that's a representation of God's powerful judgment, not just judgment, but this isn't just a river that was kind of slightly flowing and He parted it, and it didn't just kind of trickle back. It's great. It's big. It's giant. And
All right.
Let me pick up on that, Jan. People of Jericho, up on the hill. Can you imagine the visual, watching this procession of 2 million people thereabouts coming across, water's parted, ark comes across, and the moment that the feet touch the dry land, they go. And you're right, it had to be noise. It had to be
Something
a big
spectacular.
visual impact.
Yeah.
Niagara Falls, all of a sudden,
Yeah.
boom.
Yeah.
And they're standing up looking at it. They're going, oh, this doesn't look good for us.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Kennedy.
All right.
It is final. Your turn.
Dr. Kennedy, I have a question for you.
thanks for the questions.
Yeah, they were excellent
Thank you.
questions.
Yeah, they were good.
Even though I wasn't here. Question
All
I have
glory goes to God. I know nothing.
on the Ark of the Covenant that you've been talking about, have you ever followed the history forward or had an opportunity to follow it forward to the beginning of the 30s? And the reason I ask the question is, in my studies of history, when Hitler was coming to power, having been a altar boy for the Catholic Church, when he began to take over before Hindenburg's death, he had already put together an archaeology study to go find the Ark of the Covenant.
Yep.
Have you ever followed through, and what do you think was in his mind, having been taught the Catholic Church and studied under a priest, to then have that the first thing that he had done?
Okay. I don't think that his motivation was his teaching in the Catholic Church, because he was a member of the Thule Society from age 21.
Correct.
And the Thule Society is an occultic group. They are occultic in their practice, in their worship, and of course his upper level were all in the Thule Society. I think he did try, he was trying to locate it. I think that's probably what his purpose was, located for that purpose.
Do you think he believed there was power?
Yes. Yeah, I think he did. The problem is that the last we apparently hear from the ark, about the ark, is right before the Babylonian captivity.
Mm-hmm.
It undoubtedly had to have been taken into Babylon because they took everything from the temple, okay, before they burned it to the ground, right? But that's the last we know. Of course, there's a very long tradition about where the ark is, and a lot of people think that it's in Ethiopia. But
there are many speculations, but no facts. I
we
mean,
don't know
proven
for sure.
facts.
And that, honestly, that's one reason I asked the question, because as you study that history, there's no proven documentation as to where it is.
No,
And
there's not.
I even heard it's hidden underneath the temple that they burned down. There's secret chambers underneath it.
It's impossible to say. It could be interesting if it's actually revealed one day, though. All right, Joshua chapter 5. Now, let's read the first 7 verses. And I want now, listen to what you were saying. I want you to think that there's another judgment going on too. I want you to think about what that judgment is as we start to go through Joshua chapter 5. So let's read the first 7 verses. Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make for yourself flint knives, and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time." So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haarath. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nations, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. And their children whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them along the way. Okay? Now, so the people in this Transjordan area, okay, across the western side of the Jordan River, all the way to west to the Mediterranean Sea, all of those people groups heard of this miracle that occurred, and of course they were frightened. One thing, of course, is that there was a natural typological barrier, that is the Jordan River, that was easily breached. There was nothing that would prevent, of course, the Jews from coming in further. We, of course, have the promise in Deuteronomy 2:25 that God gave them. I'll read it to you. "This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under the heavens, who, when they hear the report of you, shall tremble and be in anguish because of you." God said that to them well before they ever got and crossed the Jordan River. He was preparing the invasion himself. And I think as you're going to see in this chapter and also in the next chapter, it is God's invasion. Okay? It is God's invasion. So the Lord tells Joshua to do something that no commander of any upcoming battle would want to hear. Circumcise all your men who are going to go to war.
Make them disabled.
All right, make them disabled. Okay? So that's exactly what they did. And again, this is just one aspect. Next week I'm going to tell you how the bizarre nature of the Battle of Jericho. I'm going to go through the elements of it. They're absolutely an utter contradiction to everything that's taught in the Old Testament. Point by point. It's very interesting. This is God's battle. He chooses the way to do it. And of course, it's a spiritual battle, number one. So God says they need to be spiritually prepared. And that involves circumcision, since we just read during the 40 years, none of the men were circumcised. So you have this whole new population of men, many of whom, of course, are going to be, quote, in the army as warriors, and they're uncircumcised. Now, let's talk about circumcision. Turn first to Genesis 17, and let's start at the beginning of, in the Bible, where we understand about circumcision. This, of course, is the story of Abraham. And we'll go to, in Genesis 17, we'll start in verse 7. God is making this promise. And this promise is extremely important because the fulfillment of this process is exactly what we are seeing going on in the book of Joshua. So he says, starting verse 7, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. And I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. How long would that be? Everlasting. Okay? And I will be their God. God said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. Verse 10, this is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old, which is an interesting number, okay, I don't think it's by chance, shall be circumcised throughout your generations. Even a servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants, they're supposed to be circumcised too. A servant who is born, so anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit further here, I guess. Well, let me go down to, I guess I went down to verse 12. So now, so this is a physical sign of a covenant which involves the promise of land and has a completion of a time frame. Now, why do I say that? Turn back 2 chapters in Genesis. Chapter 15, and start in verse 13. This again is God promising Abraham. He says, and God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Now that's a fun promise, isn't it? Okay? Verse 14, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation, they shall return here. Okay, remember, they're in Egypt all during this time. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now, it's a very interesting term. The iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The Amorite is a general term that is used to describe all the peoples of the non-Jewish peoples that inhabited the land that we call Israel to this day. Right? I believe that what happened in the bigger picture is that as God promised Abraham a particular area and a particular land, Satan decided there was going to be a counter proposal, a counter strategy. It involved positioning peoples and also positioning giants, Gibborim, which we'll read about as we go through Joshua, in the land to try to occupy the land so that God could not, quote, continue his promise and put Israel in the land. That is what I believe the iniquity of the Amorite is about. So it's the result of a satanic strategy, a satanic offense against God to plant these groups in Israel against God's plan. And of course, as Joshua and the people crossed the Jordan, the 430 years is done. It's over. Now the next time frame starts, the time frame that they're going to occupy the land. Now, let's look at back to Exodus 12, or go forward, I guess, if you're Genesis, to Exodus 12.
I have a question.
Yes.
In my Bible, it's got like a little note. I just want to have tonight, but it has notes on it. It says that 4 generations represented 400 years. Is that true throughout the Bible?
Not necessarily.
Generation?
The generations changed apparently over time, because we know that a generation during the days of Noah was hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. Where as time went on and the effects of sin affected literally the human genome and degraded it, you had shorter and shorter lifespans until finally generations are thought of, as you move on further in the Bible, as being closer to 70 years. Okay? The age of a person on average. So yeah, it changes. Now in Exodus 12, I want to look at verses 40 and 41. It's a very interesting 2 verses that God states to Moses. Exodus 12, 40 and 41. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. Verse 41. And it came about at the end of 430 years to the very day that all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. As Gary often says, God makes no mistakes. The timing is precise, to the moment, to the day. When the time came, it was time for Egypt to release the Jews, because it was time for them to move back into their own land as was promised to Abraham. And this is what's going on here. So the timing of God, God says to the people in the land, in essence, the Amorite peoples, you're done. Okay? The invasion is going to start. And that, of course, is what we're seeing here. Also, if you'll notice, drop down to verse 48 of chapter 12 of Exodus. There's another, I think, interesting aspect here. It says, verse 48, but if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover of the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be a native of the land, but no circumcised person may eat of it. So you could not partake of Passover as a male unless you were circumcised. Even if you were a non-Jewish guest in the Jewish home, you must accept being circumcised. That would be an interesting thing to be told, wouldn't it? You know. By the way. Okay? Now, circumcision is not only an outward sign of a covenant, of a plan, of a time frame, of a land that, of course, is underwritten by God himself, but also it has deeper spiritual purpose to it. And turn to Leviticus 19 from Exodus, or if you're in Exodus here, turn to Leviticus 19. And we're going to look at verse 23. I think I wrote that down incorrectly. I did. Sorry about that. I picked the wrong verse there. Or typed it wrong. Why don't we go, instead of that, why don't we go back to the book of Jeremiah? Back past Isaiah to Jeremiah chapter 4. Gary, you want to make any comments about circumcision? I think you're just waiting to...
I'm trying to be good.
No, go ahead, please.
First, you wonder why God chose circumcision as a sign. Second, let's go back to the story of Joseph. When he revealed himself to his brothers, he literally lifted his robe and said, "Look, I am circumcised." The Egyptians are not circumcised.
Right.
Remember the story of Joseph? All the people had to go out except his brother. But why the act of circumcision? Something that is private, but God said that's going to be my sign. I think it goes back to the story when God and Abraham were making a covenant. All the animals were split, laid out. Abraham went to sleep. God walked through the cuttings, and that ceremony was basically this. If I break this covenant, may my body be destroyed and split in pieces like these animals. So it was a virtual contract.
It's called the cutting of friendship.
The cutting of friendship.
Yeah.
Abraham was asleep. But every child, Hebrew child conceived from that point on, when the circumcision started, passed through the cutting, and that covenant was renewed with every Hebrew child. God don't make no junk. God don't make no accidents. He was saying, my covenant, that seed will pass through the covenant, or through the cutting, and every Hebrew child born from this point on will know I'm in covenant with them. They have passed through the cutting also. And this whole story today, when I was telling Tim, Juanita Genoa was up in the mezzanine and he was teaching this. And me being a bit of a smart aleck, I can just see this scene. You know, all these people, all these guys lined up, and everybody saying, "No, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. Go ahead, come on in." But can you imagine the scene? There were 600,000 fighting men, at least. So we're not talking about something that's going to take 2 minutes in the doctor's office. And Tim's going to talk about the Hill of Foreskins. What a concept.
Well, very primitive and maybe not very sharp instrument.
Yeah, a rock.
This is not a scalpel.
But those xylocaine, right?
No.
Okay. And
I think they had metal, so they had to have knives.
well, they made.
But it says flint here.
It says flint. Yeah, it does.
Well, even says somewhere we read where the men then rested, were allowed to rest after that.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, so all 600 made them lay down and, you know.
Yeah, it's just a whole. Now, I told you that the Jericho folks were standing on the mountain watching the crossing, and they get across the river, and they're going, He's doing what to them?
Well,
What?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of God is this?
mhm.
I'll shut my mouth. But it just seems like a real strange
Yes,
thing that God says to do.
it still does to me,
Yeah.
but I'm not
I
God.
think that part of it is because it's something that is, I'm sure, very painful and stuff. So if you're really, 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 not the babies because they didn't have any choice, but at this point the men that were doing it, like, what if they said, no, I'm not doing that, then that, because it's a very hard thing to do, to voluntarily do. So isn't it, because it is like that, isn't it something that really separates the men from the boys kind of thing? Not in that
Well-
way that term was created, but the
I
faithfulness
know
is the unfaithfulness.
Remember in chapter 1, I think it's verse 8 of Joshua, he starts out by saying, you must listen to the Lord's voice and be obedient, and if you do so, God will give you the land. They had to do what he told them to do. This was not a military strategy that was that Joshua came up with. We're going to see at the end of this chapter, okay? This was God's strategy.
But
Now-
if you would just experience this miracle with the Jordan River, you want to listen to what God says to do.
In Deuteronomy 10, you don't have to turn here, but Deuteronomy 10:16, the Lord says, circumcise then your heart and stiffen your neck no more. In Jeremiah 4:4, circumcise yourselves to the Lord and remove the foreskins of your heart, men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. So there is a spiritual meaning beyond of this, even, of course, which extends all the way into the New Testament. Turn to Romans 4, and Paul speaks about this. Romans chapter 4. We're going to read 9 through 12. Paul's speaking about the nature of circumcision. He says, is this blessing then upon the circumcised or the uncircumcised also? So Gentile or Jew here. For we say, quote, faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. That's a quote from Genesis, okay? It's found obviously in Genesis 15 verse 6. Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. That's the quote. Mm-hmm. He says, how then was it reckoned to him? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while he was circumcised, but rather while he was uncircumcised. Isn't that an interesting point by Paul? Mm-hmm. He had not yet been circumcised, mm-hmm. and yet he was of faith. Mm-hmm. Okay? I mean, the timeline there. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all who believe, without being circumcised, that righteousness might be reckoned to them. And the father of circumcision to those who not only are the circumcision, but also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. So the Jews, of course, wanted to claim they were fine with God because they were the children of Abraham, and they were circumcised. Of course, Paul is pointing out here, Abraham had faith before he was ever circumcised, and then later he was circumcised. So the issue is not directly circumcision. It's just a sign. It's an evidence. It's an act of faith. It's not the faith itself.
Well, they had
Well, he explains that in the next couple verses. too.
Yeah.
So when
Right.
they crossed the Jordan, what we just talked about, they weren't circumcised, so they had to have faith to walk in there.
That is
They
exactly
were
right.
Followed up.
Now, let's go on to this discussion that Gary brought up. The place that they were camped was called Gilgal. But at the point at which all the circumcision of the men occurred there, this area was named Gibeath Haraloth. You'll see it in the text. Did you see it in Joshua there? The verse? Is it what, 3 or 4? I'm not in Joshua now, but. Okay. Now, this is commonly translated in English, as Gary stated, the hill of foreskins.
Verse 3.
Okay, it's in verse 3. All right. Now, I want to give you an example of how embedded often in the language are hints of deeper meaning that you can find. And if you start to look at the language and look at its meaning, there's embedded in it different layers of information that are in there. So let's go through this as an example. Gibeath comes from an ancient root word in Hebrew, which means a small hill, that's one possible meaning, or a circle, or a place of illicit worship.
What does it mean in this?
Not legal, not right, not proper. Bad.
Can that be related till today? Jew versus Gentile, where Gentile is circumcised and there are many Jews that have refused to be circumcised. What's the point for today versus going where you are today in the book?
Well, I'm not certain necessarily where the point is today, but let me go on and try to show you in the language here what I think is in it, okay? Now, the word Gibeath is a form in Hebrew of Gilgal. They have a common root together. Now, there is, okay, let me turn this on. How do I get here now? Do I have to turn this back on?
No, we're fine.
Okay, now it didn't go to where I want it to be now. All right, here's what I want. Okay? Can you see that halfway well?
Mm-hmm.
This is a very famous place in it would be southern Syria, just across basically the current border of Israel. And this place is called Gilgal Raphaim. It's a very famous archaeological site. You can't really appreciate from this picture probably, but it's big. It's a big place.
Like how big?
I think it's several hundred meters in diameter. Okay? It's big. Now, I don't know how well you can see from where you are, but if you get up closer, and I'm sorry, I can't give you a much better picture, I don't think, from this.
You got the pointer out. Very good.
Okay, my wife's happy. All right, there are these little structures all around. Do you see them?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you got a bit better picture of them, these are called dolmens. And dolmens are, they're kind of like a pie. Okay, they're two sides and a top. And dolmens traditionally have buried underneath them certain individuals. Okay, they're a burial site. In the very center of this, and this does not show up real well in this, but actually if you look at this one, it's even a little bit better. There's a central dolmen site in the very center. That, by tradition, we don't know absolutely in fact, but that by tradition is where our friend King Og was buried, found in Deuteronomy 3.
He wasn't.
Okay?
He was not our friend.
Well, quote unquote our friend. Okay?
It's been funny.
All right. Of course, remember, his bedstand was 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. It's clearly stated he was one of the giants, the Gibrim.
Is that the one you have one picture on there? To the right? Is that the one?
You're talking about here?
No, the last one.
Here? It's just
The one you already showed us. That one. No, right?
To the right of you now.
To the right.
Keep coming. The one you said this is a better picture of it.
Look at it where it says related women.
Right, I was showing you, this is the example of the central dolmen in the middle, right?
Yeah,
here.
you enlarge that one.
Honey, can you see it on that picture?
No, that's what I didn't understand what you said.
Oh, there you go. All right.
Okay. Now, that's where tradition says Og was buried. Now, these sites they're all monoliths. Okay, just like in England, Stonehenge is a monolith, much smaller than this. Okay, these are all monolithic sites. These are places of satanic worship. They are places of spiritual power, and I think it's fair to say that when these Amorite peoples, and the Gibberim included, came into the area of Israel, they, quote, marked the land.
They sacrificed babies there.
They sacrificed children. It was very, very cruel, horrific, satanic ritual that went on. Yes. Now, mark the land, okay? Now, my suggestion is that as Gilgal Raphaim, Satan marked the land, because Raphaim literally means Gibberim. It's defined in Deuteronomy 3:11. So I believe that when Israel enters this territory, God has them mark the land. Because remember, you could easily translate the word Gibeah, Harloth, as meaning the circle of foreskins. That is a legitimate meaning of those words. So I think on a spiritual level, God is saying, in essence, to Satan, you mark the land with your circle, and now I'm marking land in an entirely different way with my circle. It's the circle of faith. It's the circle of the covenant. It's the circle of God saying, it's time. We're entering. We're taking over.
Why would God even be involved with Satan in such a manner? What was his, I mean, why didn't he just take a boots dude and get him the heck out of here?
Because in Genesis 3, when man sins, okay, God does not say, no more sin, but rather he lets this huge drama play out to its ultimate conclusion. And he lets a certain amount of evil occur because that's the intent of both Satan to lead. Remember, Satan in Genesis 3 takes over the world. He gets the title deed. So this drama continues literally until, well, literally the 19th chapter of Revelation, where finally Christ returns and says, done. Done. So that's why this occurs. So there's this constant back and forth going on between what Satan's trying to do and how God is countering what Satan's doing.
Is he trying to teach out of that?
Yes. He's trying to teach many different things. One of them, of course, being if you follow the tradition of humanity and if you follow, quote, the way of Satan, it's not going to go well. Bad things are going to happen. And, of course, there's all kinds of evidence in history of those things occurring over and over and over again. So I think this is possibly embedded in the language as a deeper meaning here. You can take it for what it is and, consider it yourself. Now, let's move on in Joshua here. I want to try to get through this chapter. And we're going to read verses 8 through 12 in Joshua 5. Now it came about, when they had finished circumcising all the nation, that they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the name of that place is called Gilgal, the rolling away, to this day. While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. And on that day, after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain, And the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Okay, now let's kind of take this apart. Go back. Let's remember the elements of the Passover. Go back to Exodus 12. Remember, God reiterates over and over again of the Passover. This is a perpetual statute forever. A perpetual statute forever. So, starting verse 2 of Exodus 12, let's read it. This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It shall be the first month of the year to you. This is the month that we call Nisan. It's more towards the middle or end of March and into April of our calendar. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each of their households. Now, back in the previous chapter, in chapter 4, and what day did they cross over the Jordan and go to Gilgal? On the 10th of Nisan. So God literally, now think of it, God brings them through this whole process, through the wilderness, all these couple million people, crosses the Jordan, and gets them on the west side on exactly the right day, the 10th of Nisan. That is not a coincidence.
It's the same day that Christ's triumphant entry into Jerusalem.
Yes, absolutely. The Lamb is selected. The Lamb is selected. Verse 4, now if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of the persons in them, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. That would be sunset. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood, put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintels of the houses in which they eat it, and they shall eat the flesh the same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Of course, becomes the tradition of what we call, for Jews, on that night, the Passover meal, which is also called the Seder. Okay? He says, do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both head and its legs along with the entrails, and you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in the manner with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste, for it is the Lord's Passover. And then, of course, he says, I'll go through the land of Egypt on that night and strike down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt I'll execute my judgment, for I am Lord. So here's the background of Passover. Passover was not observed for the 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness. So the last Passover, which had occurred, you don't have to go here, but is recorded in Numbers chapter 9, verse 1, 40 years before. Now he talks in these verses in Joshua about rolling back, Gilgal, rolling away, the reproach of Egypt. I'm going to suggest to you that it wasn't just Egypt that was the reproach here. It wasn't just their enslavement in Egypt, but rather it was their displacement from their God-given promise to the land. Now, why do I say that? Turn to the little prophet of Zephaniah, close to Zechariah, towards the end of your Old Testament here. He's right after Habakkuk. And I want you to turn to chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 8 through 10. Notice what Zephaniah tells us here. He says, I've heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the sons of Ammon, with which they have taunted my people and become arrogant against their territory. Whose territory? Whose territory is he talking about? Is he talking about Ammon's and Moab's territory? No. He's talking about Israel's territory that was promised in the Abrahamic covenant to them. Okay? He says, therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab will be like Sodom, and the sons of Ammon like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The remnant of my people will plunder them, and the remainder of my nation will inherit them. This they will have in return for their pride, that is the pride of Ammon and Moab and all these peoples, because they have taunted and become arrogant against the people of the Lord of hosts. So God is saying the reproach is bigger than just being enslaved in Egypt. The reproach is that they were displaced and kept out of the very territory that God promised Abraham. That's the taunting and the reproach he's talking about here. Now, back to Joshua, we have this very interesting comment here, or topic. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the question is, so what is manna? Because manna is talked about here.
What is it?
What is it? And of course, that's exactly what manna means. The word in Hebrew means, what is it? It was this unusual thing. Turn to Exodus 16. Now, I'm not going to read all of Exodus 16 for you. Literally, the whole chapter has to do, and you can read it for yourself, about manna. Mm-hmm. But there's some very interesting things we learn about manna in this chapter, verses 1 through 35. We learn of its purpose, which was to nourish the children of Israel. And why would that be important during this 40 years?
Bread of life.
Well, yes, but even specifically, more literally, why would that be important?
What would be important?
Why would this be so important for the children of Israel? Because it's given to them during the 40. That's the spirit. That's a spiritual application. But why literally was it so important to them? Where were they?
They're in
the desert with no water and no place to grow crops. Okay, so God said, I gotta give you something to eat, and I've got to give you some water to drink, and that's part of the purpose of manna. Okay. Secondly, it has a unique nature to it. Very unique. You wake up in the morning, and there it is on the ground.
But you have to eat it, because otherwise it'll rot.
That's right, and you collect it. And so you can eat it during that day, but you can't hold it over. Because like Ann said, if you hold it over past that day, then it turns to worms. Not good.
So in 40 years, the only menu he gave them was
except for an occasional time in which they complained about manna and he gave them quail to the point that he rained quail on them so they practically suffocated the number of quail. Okay, rather ironic, but story there. But yes. That was the bread for them was during that 4 years.
And man cannot survive on bread alone.
There you go. And of course, we're going to talk about where that comes from. Very good.
It was manna again.
That's right.
They would rot that. I can hear everybody doing that.
Sure.
Go ahead. Say again.
So you couldn't really store it.
Except for one day.
Right.
which was for
So,
Shabbat.
The reason for that was they had to count on God every single day.
Absolutely.
Okay. Then imagine after 5 years of having it every day, the same time, the same scenario, you would think it wouldn't be that necessary for people to believe that anymore. To trust,
It's the reverse.
to trust in God, because it's been there for 5 years.
Well,
Like, who
that's
cares?
true.
So they have to eat.
But that's the thing. They have really no other option because they're in a absolute,
I'm saying of the transformation of people's faith during that time and counting on God. Because the first 5 years,
Okay.
if you still, not really,
Was it tasty?
it says it was.
says it looked like coriander and tasted like
Wafers
wafers of honey.
with honey.
Yeah.
What did they do with the people that had celiac?
It was non-gluten.
Right, that was until the 1950s.
Legitimate question.
Yeah. Now let's mention some things about it as I'll summarize this chapter. It's a daily miracle. It's directly from God. It demands daily faith. And it cannot be stored except for one day, which is for Shabbat, for their Sabbath on, quote, Friday night to Saturday night. So, we see here that at this point in the book of Joshua, at the end of this 40 years, they enter into the land. It's a land now that can produce crops, that has grain, that has water, that has all the elements for them. They partake of the area around and its produce, and then the manna stops. Okay?
It's interesting that God provided manna even when his people were disobedient.
Absolutely, he did. He still fed them.
He still fed them.
I'm going to read to you from Deuteronomy 8, verses 3 and 16.
You think they'll do that then, Chinese?
I don't know. It's going to be very interesting, isn't it? Deuteronomy 8, verse 3 says, "And he humbled you, and he let you be hungry, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that," Norman, "a man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord."
Which is your menu.
Okay? And of course, there's a very famous quote of that in the New Testament. It's found in Matthew 4:4, where Jesus says, right, exactly that man does not live by bread alone, but rather from every. Now also, there's another interesting application of manna, spiritual application, because manna has its own typological fulfillment in the New Testament. Another place is in John 6. I'll read it to you. John chapter 6. And I think Janet alluded to this. It's starting in verse 31. Jesus says, "Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread out of heaven to eat. Jesus therefore said to them, truly I say to you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread out of heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread out of heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world." They said therefore to him, "Lord, evermore give us this bread." The people say that. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. And he who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." The two things that he provided them in the wilderness, water for their thirst and manna for them, are ultimately fulfilled spiritually in Christ himself.
Ties it together, well done.
It does. Because all these elements have their ultimate fulfillment. All right, let's read as Gary says, we're going to land this plane. Let's read the last 3 verses. I'm flying today. Of Joshua chapter 5. Because this starts us into the next chapter for this very interesting battle. Verses 13, 14, and 15 of Joshua 5. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn and in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, rather, indeed, I come now. I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to do with his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place that you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, we know in Exodus 17:9, in this first battle, once they leave Egypt, that Joshua, here we're told, is the commander of, quote, Moses' army, and leads them into their first battle, and certainly is the general of the Jewish army. He leads the Israeli troops. Of course, he is the night before the first battle, standing there outside on the plains of Jericho, undoubtedly contemplating the next day's plans. What am I going to do? How's this going to go? How do we do this? Suddenly, he meets this military figure with sword drawn. Now, the question is, how might you react?
Well, he instinctively, asked him, "Are you
Exactly.
ours or are you enemy?"
I pull the gun, make a decision right on the spot.
I think there's every reason to believe that Joshua might be pulling his sword at this point.
That's exactly the way
Okay.
I look at it.
But he does, fortunately, ask the question. Are you for us or against us?
Well, it depends if he was in Walmart.
Now, it's interesting we see here in this verse, the captain of the Lord's host says, "I come now as." What's the implication?
Christ incarnate.
But what's the implication? I agree.
Oh, I now come.
In other words, I've come in different forms, right? I come now as.
Oh, that's right.
In this case, I'm coming as, quote, the captain of the Lord's host. The word captain in Hebrew is the word sar, and it doesn't mean captain in the sense that we think of it. Rather, it means the general or supreme commander of troops. He says he's the supreme commander of the Tasaba Yahovah. That is, the Lord's army. And the word Tasaba means what? What kind of army is it?
It's an angelic.
It's an angelic army. We went through that multiple times in the book of Zechariah, didn't we? So he says, I'm the supreme commander of the angelic army of God. That's what he tells Joshua. And, of course, this, as Jan said, is another theophany. That's the word we use. God showing himself in a particular form in history at a particular time is called a theophany. And this is the theophany that occurs here.
And how do we know that?
Well,
Because when Joshua saw it, he fell down
yes,
and worshiped.
yes.
When it's the angel always says, "Get on your feet. I am a servant just like you."
Mm-hmm.
Worship was accepted at that point, which proves it was the incarnate Christ.
Right, exactly. And there are many examples of this, but Daniel 10:9, 9 through 11 is an example where an angel shows up and Daniel starts to fall down and worship. And what does the angel say to Daniel? Get up.
Get up.
Get up. Don't worship me. I'm just the servant of the Lord. So Gary's absolutely right. Now, we see here also Another proof of the point that this was the Lord is he says an interesting thing. Let's read it again. He says, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place in which you're standing is holy. Ever heard that one before?
Moses.
Where'd you hear it? Moses in Exodus 3, exactly, in verse 5, the burning bush that was never consumed but burned. As Moses sees this and asks, who are you? He, of course, says, remove your sandals, for this is holy ground, and then he makes this grand statement that defines God, I am that I am. In other words, I'm the ever-existent one, the one who never ends, the infinite personal God himself. This is what he tells Moses. So, Joshua is now ready to hear instructions for the battle and realizes that this battle will be fought by who?
God.
By God, the captain of the Lord's host.
Yes.
And of course, this sets the stage for, as next week, as we talk about the battle at Jericho. Because indeed, you're going to see this is uniquely and enigmatically God's battle.
Sets the stage for victory.
It does. It does. All right. That's the 5th chapter of Joshua.
You realize
Comments?
3 weeks from 3 chapters?
Yes.
I'm so proud of you.
I know. I didn't think it was possible
I
either.
know, I know.
Gary, could you close us in a word of prayer?